So I thought I'd start by just sharing a little bit about why this is a topic that I feel strongly about and that I'm passionate about. When I think back on my experience, just throughout my own journey and my own faith journey, and just kind of my life journey in general, um, when I think of moments that have been really transformational for me personally, um, often that seems like it has occurred in the context of a group. And that has not necessarily always been a church group, but it sometimes has. In fact, I was kind of reflecting on the people in my life that I'm probably the adults that I'm closest to in my life right now. First of all, my partner, Dusty, who I've been married to for 21 years, he and I met at a Christian camp that we worked at for 2 summers, and we were camp counselors there. So, as a members of the staff, it was a low budget camp, so we had to be pretty creative putting together different activities and putting together a carnival at the end of the week. And just the dynamics of being in that group together gave us the opportunity to get to know each other, not just one on one, but to kind of see how we interacted with kids, with other people, and all kinds of different ways of getting to know each other. And so obviously he's one of my closest people in life. I also think about my best friend Jamie, who she and I got to know each other at Emory Counseling Center when we were doctoral interns, among a small group of interns there, who was a very close group that did a lot of intensive training and work with clients in that setting. Another close friend, Danielle, who I just had breakfast with today, is somebody who I met in a small group through church, a couples small group that we were in together for years. And she and I actually had babies. Our both of us, our second born, around the same time. And so she was also somebody I got to know through a group. So when I think of often these people that I have gotten really close to and that have ended up being really enduring relationships, they have often started out in that context of a group. When I think about spirituality as well, I think about God, speaking to me personally, I feel like through people a lot of times, and um, through the context of small groups, speaking through people. So, when I've brought up complex kinds of questions or issues that I've talked about in small groups, often I walk away feeling like something's been clarified through another person's perspective or something that they've shared with me. I also believe that God shows us parts of ourselves through other people that we really can't access in other ways. I think sometimes it feels safer to us to be in our heads or kind of step back and have an analytical kind of way of looking at things and trying to figure ourselves out, trying to figure out our dynamics in our lives. But I think there's ways that unless you're getting close to another person, being vulnerable with them, growing in a way that they really see you and you see them on a deeper level, those are times that we can really get to know ourselves better too. And if you're interested, my other book that I wrote first is Revealed, as was mentioned, What the Bible Can Teach You About Yourself. That book is uh, about looking at the narratives in scripture and some of the characters in scripture and how you see yourself in those characters. And really, the book is about identity and kind of pulling from those narratives things that help you look at yourself in a more self-aware and self-compassionate way. If that is of interest to you, I just wanted to mention it. I also think that we have kind of a common core need for belonging as people. I mean, we all sort of have a need to feel seen, to feel valued, to feel connected to each other. So for all of these reasons, I feel like groups are important. I wanted to begin with this quote that I really like by Parker Palmer, and I'm just going to read it aloud. And I would like you to kind of take it in and let it be something that you reflect on as we talk about groups tonight, because I think sometimes we want to actively figure out things, and often it goes a long way just to be present with someone. And that's so important for us to remember as small group leaders. I think to um it's an active role to be a leader, but it's also a role that requires some intuition and tuning into the needs of the moment, tuning into what's happening in the moment, and allowing people to kind of go at their own pace. So I'm just going to read this aloud. The human soul doesn't want to be fixed. It simply wants to be seen and heard. The soul is like a wild animal, tough, resilient, and shy. When we go crashing through the woods, shouting for it to come out so we can help it, the soul will stay in hiding. But if we are willing to sit quietly and wait for a while, the soul may show itself. So this quote kind of moved me. And as I was thinking about, doing therapy in particular in a lot of group settings. So I worked in an intensive center for eating disorder treatment for 13 years, and I did a lot of group therapy in that setting. I also did some group therapy on my own as a participant starting in college. In fact, that was one of my first experiences with therapy, where I went to the college counseling center and I was seeking some help. And they said, we don't have an individual therapist that can see you, but we recommend that you do this group. And I was actually really skeptical at first, and I did not want to do the group. I was very nervous, but I finally decided, okay, I can go to the group. If I don't like it, I'll just go the one time and I don't have to go back. But it ended up being a really transformative experience for me. And I found out that the people in the group were a lot like me. They were all just kind of wanting to connect around a particular issue. And there's something about being in group therapy that I think is distinctly different from being an individual. I think there's an element, and as an individual therapist now, I hear people say, well, this is your job to support me. I'm paying you. You of course are going to tell me that I have value and all these positive things. And I think something that's unique about a group therapy setting is that sometimes the most value in it is not necessarily what you get from the therapist, but what you get from the interactions with the other people who don't have to be telling you things. And as a therapist, I do seek to be authentic with people and say things that I mean and share honestly, and we build trust so that they can understand that. But uh, in group, you may hear something from another participant that hits you in a different way maybe than what a therapist would say. And so there's kind of a unique way that groups can be healing in a therapy context. Also, when I was in the eating disorder center working, what we noticed and what we sort of know about group therapy versus individual is that group is often a quicker way to make progress. So it tends to be sort of a more intense therapy environment and to help people progress quicker than individual. In fact, if people's symptoms were getting too intense, sometimes we would take them out of groups and have them just do individual therapy in that treatment center because they needed to kind of stabilize their symptoms, and then they could go back into the groups. But the groups were often pretty emotionally intense. So getting back to small groups in a church setting, Dusty and I, my partner, he and I were serving as discipleship co-chairs at our church, at our Methodist church that we attend here in Atlanta. And something that we saw a need for was just equipping leaders. So this is back before I wrote the book. And it's one of the reasons I wrote the book, because we found a lot of people in the church wanted to be in a small group, but nobody really wanted to lead. And nobody really felt equipped to lead. There were just all kinds of reasons that people would say, I'm not sure that I'm really equipped to do that. And there's a lot of myths about leading small groups. I think, that maybe you have to be trained in some sort of special Bible training, or that you have to have a lot of answers for people is another myth, I think, or that you're alone as a leader is a myth. I mean, I think in a good leadership scenario, you're seeking input from other leaders, you're connected to other leaders. So people can tend to avoid that leadership position and just feel like they're not equipped, they don't have enough time, or whatever the reason is. So but through doing so many groups, so Dusty and I led many small groups over the years, and I've led these therapy groups, and there's really a set of skills that it's not very hard to understand. It is sort of hard to put into practice, but there's some key ideas that, if I think, can make you an effective leader. And a lot of it is about just feeling equipped and having confidence and understanding that there's not really one right way to do it either, that your personality and your authenticity as a leader is going to help it to be an effective group. So, so this idea, going back to the quote, to sit quietly and wait for a while, you don't always have to be talking as a leader. Sometimes it's about creating space and just allowing people to open up in their own timing. I want to give you a quick overview of what we'll talk about tonight for week one. First, I want to give you just a sort of a general idea what works in groups, just generally what works to create transformation. Next week, we're going to get into 8 specific strategies that will help you create transformation in your group. But I want to talk today first about a little bit of theory about the stages of groups and kind of how groups work, and what you personally bring to a group and how to understand and reflect, do some kind of self-reflection about the type of role that you tend to play in a group and some of the dynamics that you might bring with you that is actually some expertise that you already have about groups, whether you know it or not. And then we'll do a little bit of writing tonight. So I hope everyone has the handout one and a pen with them, or just a piece of paper. I'll give you some prompts, and that will get you thinking about things we'll talk about in the breakout rooms. There'll also be an opportunity for Q&A before we go into the breakout rooms. So we will have an opportunity for that. After the breakout rooms, please stick around and come back, because I'm going to talk about some things specific to the challenges during a pandemic and coming out of a pandemic, some self-care strategies for leaders that I think are especially relevant right now, as I think all of us are feeling it at the 1 year mark here recently, of just everything that this last year has entailed. So I do want to mention the book that is a resource with a lot of the things we're going to talk about tonight. This book was my second book and came out with Upper Room Books in 2020. So it actually came out right in the middle of the pandemic, which at first seemed a little ironic to me that I had a book about gathering, coming out in the middle of the pandemic. And I thought at first, is this even going to be relevant to anyone? But what's interesting is that I think the pandemic has reminded us how important gathering is. And we've had to get kind of creative about it, but, we've still had to sort of find ways to be connected in some way. And I think a lot of us have experienced isolation. But it's my hope for you that there's been some kind of connection through Zoom or text groups or something. And we've had to get creative, but we still have, found some ways to gather. I know I have participated in a number of Zoom groups that I've attended just on different topics throughout the pandemic. But, I think we're all getting a little zoomed out if we've done things like that. But, we've kind of had to find other ways. But the actual gathering has not become less important in any way. In fact, maybe even more important during this time. But one of my passions writing this book was to bring psychology into small groups a little more, and in particular, self-awareness, self-compassion. I think those are real gifts that the field of psychology can give to the church setting and ministry setting, and allow us to do more effective ministry as we integrate psychological concepts into our faith journey and into the way that we're leading small groups. So, there's some different ways that the book helps you. As I mentioned, the different stages. There's 11 characteristics of transformative groups that I'm going to mention tonight. And again, next time we'll talk about the strategies and some of the problems that can arise in groups as well. But to just touch on each of these things that are doing what works. And when I say doing what works, I mean doing what works in order to create the experience of emotional and spiritual transformation. There is a difference between therapy groups and small groups. And I think that's important to kind of bear in mind. Therapy groups are led by a licensed professional who is trained in helping people, process complex emotional dynamics. And so it's not necessary that small groups, ministry small groups, be therapy groups. In fact, it wouldn't really be appropriate, but there is an element of emotional support that I think is really important to be present in small groups in really any setting. But small group Bible studies, small group studies, um, and gatherings within ministry setting, um, can really benefit from knowing some of these therapy concepts. And we benefit from having a faith that is a faith that it resides in our whole self, not just our heads, not just our theological perspectives, but our whole body, our bodies, our emotions, our whole self. And I really believe when we let our faith kind of live in all of those different aspects of who we are, that is going to be the most powerful sort of way to experience God and experience our faith in our faith journey. So we will talk about navigating the stages of groups. There are 5 that we'll talk about. We'll talk about seeking transformation. And this basically has to do with the fact that all of us experience wounding in relationships. I don't think any of us escapes that totally. But we also experience healing in relationships. So if we can kind of acknowledge both of those, and realize that even if we've had a lot of wounds in relationships, there is also a lot of potential for healing through relationships. Becoming a transformational group, I'm going to mention 11 factors that are, there's this therapist, Irvin Yalom, who is sort of the father of group psychotherapy, and he's researched and presented this theory of 11 factors that create a transformational group. So we'll mention those. I'll talk about process versus content in a group, and then how to enter the system with a strong start. So groups are changing systems. They're not static. They are always changing. So if you have one person that's absent one week or somebody new to the group, I'm sure you've noticed, there are different dynamics going on. Or even if it's the same people, that all those people are experiencing things and changing week to week. So the dynamic is always a little bit different, depending what's going on with people. So first of all, these are the stages of a group. So they all sort of rhyme: forming, storming, norming, performing. And then I always feel like I need to say adjourning. So it sounds like it rhymes with the other ones, but normally I say adjourning. But forming is just kind of when the group is first coming together. It tends to be when maybe there's a little bit of anxiety and uncertainty about what the group is going to entail. And so, it's important to, as a leader, try to bring some comfort and some clarity as to what the group is going to be. And through communicating clearly, through making sure people know where to show up, when to show up, how the group is going to function, what the general structure of it is. And everybody's just kind of feeling it out in that stage. And, if you think of groups you've been a part of, you may relate to that. Then the group tends to move into the second stage called storming, where maybe there does start to be a little bit of conflict in, and this doesn't have to be, intense arguments or something when I say conflict, but just maybe some conflicting ideas about what the group should study or what the group is going to be, some differences of opinion on things. There can be some frustration, uh, some evaluation of the leader, or maybe challenging of authority, things like that. And so this is not a bad thing. That's one point I want to make. Conflict is not bad. It's actually healthy. I, in fact, get worried if there's no conflict at all in a group. There's a concept called groupthink that you have likely heard of, that, if people are too conforming to the ideas of a group and they're not thinking critically and valuing differing perspectives, the group can take on this quality called groupthink and become more extreme in its views, without that sort of the healthy challenging of perspectives and openness to differing perspectives. So conflict is okay and good. And it typically starts to happen in that storming stage. Then you sort of transition into this norming stage where some of that conflict starts to get resolved and there are closer bonds between group members. There's some feedback given and received. And that is, is starting to kind of flow and become the group that it is during that. And the norms of the group are clearer. Then the performing stage of the group is where it feels kind of easier. There's a stronger core to the group. The goals of the group are starting to be achieved. Maybe you're completing the study or doing different ministry things together. People are really growing spiritually, growing personally, emotionally through the group. And then finally, adjourning. This always makes me think of someone that I ran into in one of the places in the neighborhood. This was before COVID, but she was asking me, is it okay to end our group? And of course it's okay to end a group. And that doesn't mean that a group has failed. I do think it's best that a group end in a way that has been clearly communicated. So some groups are fixed length groups where you say this is going to be a 2-month group or a 1-year group, and everybody's clear that there's a fixed time around it. Other groups are open-ended and there's not really a right or a wrong, but if it's open-ended, I do think it's a good idea to sort of touch base with everyone in the group from time to time and say, does everybody want to continue the group for another season? Or are some people feeling like they might like to move on at this point? And to know that that's all okay. Some people might get to a different stage where they're not available to do the group, or they're just interested in doing something else. That's all okay. I think a healthy group has space for people to make that decision to leave if they're ready to leave. And again, it doesn't mean that something is wrong with the group or wrong with anyone in the group, but just sometimes the dynamics shift and somebody's ready to leave, and that's okay. But all of it happens better if there's open communication and the leader can sort of set that tone, checking in with everybody, and welcoming feelings about it too. If it's a fixed group and you all are ending, maybe you have an event at the end and you give everybody an opportunity to share what the group has meant to you, some sort of closure type activity or sharing can be really, really helpful. I was in the Methodist Church, we do this disciple Bible study. That's a structured study where you cover like 70% of the Bible in a year. So it's pretty intense with a lot of reading. But the last group, you give each other feedback about spiritual gifts and things that you see in one another. And it's one of the most powerful groups. I attended it as a participant. And I really, really valued that feedback from other people who we had spent this year together. And, I was giving them feedback, they were giving me feedback. And it was really powerful to hear kind of each other's strengths as they had been witnessed in one another over the year. So that was really a nice experience. This is just sort of showing you a page from the book that I think is a pretty good resource regarding these stages. So, when I talked about the difference between these are stages that describe therapy groups, but I've taken them and described them and then kind of pulled out what would be some goals for small group leaders based on kind of reflecting on these stages. So if you have Gather Us In, it's on page 32, but I also just printed it here or included it, for some guidelines on what you might do with this information as a leader. So seeking transformation is another thing that you're doing what works in groups. There's something in therapy called the corrective emotional experience that happens when, if you can think about a time when somebody in your life treated you better than you expected them to, maybe based on your past experiences, you expected something to happen that was more negative, but instead something happened that was positive. And this can be a really corrective, healing sort of experience for us, whether you're in a therapy group or you're just living your life and you have that kind of interaction. So this is the kind of thing that I think we benefit, not just in a therapy group, but in a small group of any kind of trying to encourage these sorts of experiences for people. So, for instance, maybe people have grown up in some chaotic environments. You can provide a corrective experience for them just by having some kind of structure and dependability built into the group week to week, and clear communication. Maybe they didn't have clear communication happening in their experience growing up or currently with other relationships. So you can provide a healing experience around that. Another example is providing grace, where maybe they have encountered rigidity or judgment in the past, in a small group kind of setting, and you have the opportunity as a leader to provide a more inclusive sort of grace experience for them. Another example is creating space for emotion. Sometimes in groups or in relationships, emotion gets kind of shut down or minimized, or it's somebody tries to fix someone's emotions. And a lot of us, when it comes to emotion, just need to kind of let ourselves ride the wave of emotion, let ourselves have the space to have emotion, and it will pass. Sometimes we get scared of having those emotional experiences, but um, in a group setting, you can kind of create space and comfort for that. And the more you're comfortable with your own emotional experience, the more you're going to be comfortable with those around you. A biblical example that comes to mind is Jesus and the woman who's caught in adultery, and all the judgment and the stones that people are starting to get ready to throw at her. And Jesus is instead offering the perspective of asking the crowd to self-reflect and um, consider that they are not perfect, and that maybe they ought to drop the stone. So if we can imagine ourselves living in by that sort of example of just dropping stones of accusation, and instead trying to offer grace to people, that can be a very powerful sort of corrective experience. There are, as I mentioned, so this is the kind of founder of group psychotherapy, Irvin Yalom. He has a really interesting memoir. If that interests you, or if you like that sort of thing, I thought it was good. It talks about kind of his whole life experience, and his experience with groups and providing therapy. He's an excellent writer, and he identified these different factors of groups. And this may be helpful for you to think about in terms of, like, think about a group that you have been a part of that has been transformative for you. If you can bring one to mind right now, and it doesn't even have to be through ministry or through a church, but just some group that really influenced you. And so as I talk about these different qualities, try to ask yourself, how was that a quality that was present in that group that I liked? So the first one is a sense of hope. So is there a general sense of uh, hopefulness that we can move towards something better? Um, and that tends to be a quality of a good group. To instill hope in people is important. Um, that change can occur slowly but surely. The second is unity, or what they call universality. This idea that we are not alone. We can feel alone. But what it comes down to, it, one thing that Yalom found is that most people have kind of three common secrets. If a person has a big secret, they tend to be one of three things. And those three things are either that the person feels like an imposter and some degree of inadequacy, and they can feel shame about that. Um, the second one is a profound sense of alienation from other people. And then the third one is just some sort of secret that is sexual in nature. So most people, if they have something that they're not sharing that's really a deep secret, it tends to be one of those things. And he's done tons and tons of group therapy where people get into all kinds of deeper layers of their experience. And he finds that, though people can feel so alone in those three places of their experience, they you know, the reality is so many people, that share that sort of experience, and that it's actually more universal than we realize. And when we share that with other people and realize we're not alone, that goes a long way to decrease shame and isolation and to help us have a healing experience. So also helpful information is part of a good group. So that could be, just strategies for prayer or theological information, or any kind of thing that the group might be studying. Altruistic opportunities. So often when we've led a group, we've tried to seek some sort of service opportunity that the group does together, and that can strengthen the bonds in the group. The corrective experiences I already sort of mentioned. Socializing, just having social relationships, tends to create a soothing experience for people, as long as those are positive sorts of social experiences. As a leader, you can also sort of model positive behaviors, um, model interpersonal skills. So as you're thinking of the group, whatever one you have in mind, was that a cohesive group? Did it seem to gel together, where people felt a part of the group and where everybody had a part in the group? Uh, Emotional expression was welcome. Was there a space for that to occur? Also, questions of meaning and purpose tend to be there in a transformational group. So there's room to ask the big existential kinds of questions. And again, as a leader, you don't have to have all the answers to those, but simply facilitate the space to, for people to ask them and sit with the hard questions together. So another thing that works is to think about talking not just about content, but process. So this is something in therapy that we try to do. If I ever start to feel, I think probably all of us have had the experience that you're in some kind of group where you start to feel a little bored. Well, if you're the leader, you actually have the opportunity to shift that very quickly by switching from content to process. So content would be any information that's being shared, any stories being shared. It's kind of what I'm doing now, to talk about the group process. I'm talking about it through information and stories. Process is what's happening in the here and now. Like, what is your experience of someone else in the group? And what is your emotional experience that's happening in this moment? And if that is a place that you can get people to connect with and talk about, you'll see that often everybody's attention kind of shifts, and people seem more present. And there's like an aliveness that occurs as you talk about process. So I wrote some examples here, just drawing attention to, it seems like you feel strongly about this topic that we're talking about. It would be a comment that draws attention to the process, or giving somebody feedback. I don't see you that way. I value you, if someone is questioning something about themselves. And there's some other examples there. So think about not just content, but also process. And then also entering the system. So this is the part where I would ask you to kind of reflect on your own experience, thinking back even to your family of origin. What role did you play in that sort of setting? Our families, or whoever raised us, is kind of our first group experience. And so whatever our role tended to be in that setting, we can often bring that with us into new group settings. So if you were always kind of a peacemaker sort of person in your home, you might tend to also play that role in a group that you go into, whether you're the leader of the group or a participant. Either way, you're probably going to bring those tendencies with you, and so will everyone else. So you can see where there's a lot of complex dynamics going on in the system, and that's always changing, as I mentioned. So something you can do as you think of like starting a new group and everyone entering a new system, that can be a time of anxiety for people. And, they're starting something new. To build your own sense of empathy about that, I think it's a good practice to just try new things. Remember how it feels to do something for the first time that maybe everyone around you is familiar with, but you're not. So a recent example for myself is learning to play tennis. I've hit a lot of balls over the fence and hit them wrongly into the net and stuff because I am just starting to learn for the very first time, and it's hard. But so the first time I went to tennis, I did not know how to do it. It was anxiety provoking because I like to be good at things and I wanted to be good right away. And of course, it takes practice. So it could be something like that, or it could be just attending a different sort of religious service that you've never been to before, a different person's church, a different, just a different place in general. Be out of your comfort zone and remember how that feels to people who are coming into your group. And expect some anxiety. It's normal to have some anxiety. We just need to kind of have some skills for managing it. So the goal doesn't have to be to eliminate anxiety, but just to be aware how you can best manage it. Um, okay, so I want to move to the writing prompts now. So if you would grab your first handout, I'm going to ask you to try to be kind of unfiltered. So you're not going to have to share this word for word if you don't want to in the breakout rooms. This is really just for you. But these prompts are relevant for what we're going to talk about in the breakout room. So I'm going to give you a 3-minute window for the first prompt, and then I'll tell you when to switch to the second one, and we'll do 3 minutes for the second one. The goal here is to try not to pick up your pen, just be as unfiltered as you possibly can and keep the pen moving. So I'm going to ask you first to just, start with this first prompt. As I reflect on my faith journey, some key feelings and experiences that come to mind are. So you can go anywhere you want with this, but this might be the sort of thing that you would ask people to share their first week in a group, or maybe as you're getting to know people in a group. So I'm going to go ahead and tell you right now, just to go ahead and start the 3 minutes, and I'll tell you when the 3 minutes is up, and we'll move on to the second one. Okay. So go ahead. Okay, so go ahead at this point and switch to the second prompt. What I notice about myself in all kinds of group settings is that I often, okay, so you can finish up the last bit that you're writing there. And this will be something you can take with you. As I said, it will be up to you how much you decide to share in the breakout room. But we'll be transitioning to the breakout rooms in just a little bit after we do the Q&A portion. So also be thinking about any questions that you might have that you want to ask in a minute. When you move into the breakout rooms after that, there are a couple of questions that are relevant to what you just wrote. So part of starting a group strong is, trying to make it comfortable enough for people, but to also delve into a level of depth that it's going to feel like it's worth their time to come to the group and they're having a meaningful connection. So one way to get to know people better, if you don't already know each other in the group, is to ask, what has your faith journey been like? But maybe a brief version of that. So to even say in 3 to 5 minutes. And if they want some more guidance than that, then you might say, you could share something about your family of origin, your experience in different faith communities, and what is your personal faith like, just within yourself. So and you could ask about where you've been, where are you now, where do you hope to go? So that's what I'll ask you, to reflect on together, and share in the breakout rooms as you're comfortable. The second question for the breakout room there is, what is your role in groups? So what do you notice about when you enter a group setting? What do you tend to do? Do you tend to conform? Do you tend to challenge the norms? Do you tend to be a mediator? Are you a peacemaker? Do you step up and lead readily? So that's the sort of thing that I'll ask you to share. We'll do about 15 minutes in the breakout rooms. But first, I do want to allow some time for Q&A. So however we want to moderate, that is fine with me. If anybody has a question, do you want to put it in the chat or just ask?
Sure. So Angela, I'm going to stop your screen share for the moment so we can all see each other.
Okay.
And we had one question early on, so I'm going to ask, I have to scroll back up in the chat to find it.
Yeah.
Larry and Anne. If Larry and or Anne would like to unmute and share their question, please do so. And if you want to type your question in the chat with a Q, I will invite people to unmute and ask their question so we can hear it in your own words. You're also welcome to raise your hand.
I'm happy to share my question. Someone else who's in the group and I are about to start a new group. And I think one of our major concerns is how to create an environment in which people feel safe enough to be really vulnerable and open.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. One of the strategies we'll talk about next week is know and share yourself and how to do that in a balanced way. I think as the leader, you set the tone for the vulnerability that is welcome. People are going to differ in their comfort level in sharing. And part of that is just going to be based on people's comfort level. But I think you encourage an environment of safety when when you clearly state that to start out, sort of what are the values of this group going to be? What are the norms going to be? Are we going to keep things confidential that are shared here? Hopefully, that will be talked about. I think people will relax into the group and feel safer when they know that there's some structure around it and some specific ways that you as the leader want to make it safe. So that might be one to say, now as the leader, you can't guarantee confidentiality, but you can encourage it and ask the group members to commit to that. And sometimes I've seen groups even have like a written group covenant where they'll say, here's what we're all agreeing to as a group, and let's all sign it together and say that we're committing to, keep what is shared here in the group, things like that. So I think that can increase a sense of safety. But also, like I said, setting the tone as the leader. If you share some vulnerable things, then I think others will feel a little more welcome to do that as well. Thanks
Excellent.
for that question.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So we have another question from Bob. Bob, would you like to unmute and share your question?
Sure. Hello.
Hi.
Are the kind of the rules of stages of group and the characteristics, are those scalable? Meaning those kind of apply whether the group's a small group of 5 or a whole organization of 5,000, or are those written particularly for small groups?
That's a great question. And from what I remember studying those, they were in the context of a therapy group, which is typically going to be 8 to 12-ish people. It certainly differs, but that's sort of considered the ideal therapy group size. 12's a little on the large side for a therapy group. 8 is probably kind of ideal. Excuse me. I've also led therapy groups with 2 or 3 people, just depending, if we were, for instance, at the treatment center, and that's just all that we had signed up for group that day. It was a smaller group, but yes, that's generally the size, like 8 to 12.
Okay.
Mhm. My guess is, though, that there might be some similar things that occur on a larger scale, but that's referenced for a smaller group.
Okay. Yeah, and I was
Mhm.
thinking more that the 5 stages of a group I feel like in some management class I learned those as
Oh, really?
stages of an organization's life
Uh-huh.
cycle. But I could
Right.
see how the 11 characteristics
Mhm.
seem to be tighter to a small group than like what you
Mhm.
would think is going to happen in a whole organization. So
True.
now that I
Mhm.
asked my question, I thought about it a little differently, that you presented 2
Right.
different sets of
Right.
checklist kind of things. And the first one is the one that reminds me of like an organization life cycle. The other one does feel a little more like opportunity for some intimacy that you maybe wouldn't have in a large
Mhm.
cultural group, so to speak.
Mhm. The Yalom's 11 factors
Right.
feel more relevant to you to a smaller group, you're saying? Yeah.
Thank you.
I would agree. Thanks.
We have another question from Sally. Sally, would you like to share your question?
Sure. So I'm partnering with Larry. I'm that person who's partnering. So we have a curriculum that's about 9 weeks, and we have a small group that's forming. And several of the people don't know each other. They're new. I'm just wondering how much time, it feels like we're rushing formation, but maybe I'm off base on that. Is there a certain amount of time that is required for a group to kind of get to know each other and before they start delving deeper?
I think every group is going to differ a little bit based on the personalities of the group and the readiness and openness of those group members, and just the tone of, just different people mixed together are going to create a different sort of tone. And but as I said, you as the leader can sort of set a tone to delve deeper. If you're sensing that everyone's kind of staying safe meaning like, I hope everyone is staying safe, but staying with safer topics and not delving into maybe some things that would be a little more vulnerable. You could, as the leader, ask a question that goes a little deeper. But as a group leader, I would usually say, if you feel comfortable sharing, and then I would ask the question so that no one's feeling pushed to share more than they want to, but they're invited. That's usually how I look at it, is I want to invite you to go to dig a little deeper into this topic. Is anyone having a strong reaction to this element of it? Or I realize this is a topic that can bring up a lot of feelings. Is anyone wanting to share more about what this brings up for them? Are some kinds of questions that I might ask to bring it a little deeper. And so, but how quickly that happens, I think it's going to happen quicker when people share personal things about themselves. So that's where sharing the faith stories I have found to be pretty effective way, sharing about their faith journey, maybe early in the group, like maybe not the first week, but if you were to say the first week, next week, I would like us all to go around and just briefly share 1 or 2 things about where you've been on your faith journey. That often takes the group deeper pretty quickly.
Okay, thank you.
We have another question from Martha. Martha, can you ask your question?
Sure, thanks, Rowan. So I apologize, I joined a few minutes late, and you may have already talked about this, but I'm curious about your definition, Angela, of transformational small group.
Okay.
And I'm not sure if that pertains to a particular kind of group as I've been listening to you, or that all groups can be transformational, but I'm just curious about your use of that term and what that means.
What it means to me in the context that I'm talking about it here, I think, is primarily spiritual transformation, with a focus on emotional transformation being a part of that. So, hopefully people are moving toward a deeper relationship with God or a deeper experience of spirituality through their connection to other people.
Okay, those are the questions I see in the chat. I'll do a quick scan across my screen for raised hands. I think those are the questions we have for right now.
All right. Thank you. We'll do some Q&A next week too. And so if there are things that come up in between, you know, I'd be happy to address those next week, or anything we talk about next week too might bring up some other questions. But I guess we'll just transition to the breakout rooms now.
Yep, and I will share the questions again in the chat once y'all are in your rooms.
That's interesting.
Okay, it looks like
Right.
we are back.
All right. I'll go back to the share screen then. Okay, well, I hope your time in the breakout rooms was helpful to you, that you had maybe a small group experience within this experience briefly. But my hope is that you could use prompts like that, you know, maybe even in your small group to try that with the writing, you know, especially if you feel that people aren't, maybe they're reluctant to go deeper, or you have a quieter group. Sometimes writing can open people up a little bit to be ready to share. So I hope that's something you can take with you as a tool. I want to say a couple words about virtual groups, just because of the pandemic and how relevant that is right now. I was mentioning to Rowan and Lee just how I've been doing a lot of virtual therapy and participating in a number of groups over the pandemic, you know, and so we're seeing virtual telehealth therapy, virtual church experiences, virtual small groups, Sunday school, all kinds of different things going on. There's pros and cons. I think I wrote a article for Upper Room, my publisher, that is on 10 tips for leading a small group on Zoom there, that I believe Rowan put in the chat, right, earlier. So thanks, Rowan, for doing that. If you want to take a look at that, it's a resource. But I think there are pros and cons. There are some things about, you know, the comfort and convenience of being in your own space, of not needing to commute. In Atlanta, that's kind of a big deal, that, you know, people are finding it easy to tune into their telehealth session and not need to sit in traffic to get somewhere. So there's some pros, and sometimes people feel more confidential in their own space, or they can feel less confidential. I've also had that experience where maybe they don't feel like they can talk as freely because someone's in the next room or something. So I think that can vary based on different people's experience. But the important thing, I think, as a leader is to continue with what we've talked about, which is to communicate openly and maybe check in with people. First of all, making sure that they have information about how Zoom works up front and what that will look like. You know, the first time you jump on Zoom, it can be a little overwhelming maybe to know what all the functions are, or to see everybody looking at you. You know, that can be sort of unsettling for some people, and you know, especially when it's new. So just letting people know what to expect, letting them know how to navigate it can be important and add to that comfort. It's really the same concepts we talked about earlier, as far as creating a comfortable environment and helping decrease anxiety, communicating about the structure, but you're just doing it in a little bit different way through the virtual groups. So there's pros and cons. You also lose I think, an element of the nonverbal experience and the presence of being with people, just feeling someone's presence. I don't know. I tend to value that and really feel that as a therapist. I'm often kind of reading very subtle shifts in people's moods and body language and things like that. So for me, I feel like I'm kind of missing out on a lot of that over Zoom. But, you know, a lot of the experience, I've had clients say to me that have started therapy on Zoom, they've said, I don't feel like I'm missing anything, by being on Zoom. I think this is a quality therapy experience, that it's just as good as what I would get other times. So I think that definitely closeness and belonging and all of the things we've talked about are possible in virtual groups. So it's worth doing. And we're learning to do it better through this time in the pandemic. So I wanted to offer some self-care tips for leaders, especially given how stressful this year has been for so many. Almost every therapist I feel like that I know has a full caseload. It's sort of getting hard to find referrals for people, and I keep getting a lot of calls. My caseload's full. I'm trying to get people connected, but there's just a lot of need right now for support. And so we're all needing to kind of shore up our best resources for self-care. And that's incredibly important as a leader. If you're coming to lead a group and you are depleted and don't have a lot to give, it's hard to be present, and it's hard to be processing things and talking to your group in a meaningful way and being emotionally available. So it's really helpful if you can have some strategies. So the theme here is loving your neighbor as yourself, not instead of yourself or before yourself, and thinking about valuing yourself equally as you value others. So on handout 2, I have a list of some different self-care strategies that are kind of go-to things I offer with to clients a lot, but also talk with other leaders about as well. So we're going to go over some of those. I mentioned taking care of yourself as well as others. Naming and owning your own vulnerability and struggle. So this is something, as mentioned earlier, that you can set a tone for vulnerability and struggle being something that's welcome in the group, and modeling that. And this doesn't mean necessarily sharing everything that's going on with you, but just being authentic. And you don't have to feel pressured to have it all together or to be functioning really, really well all the time as a leader. We're all human, and we all have struggle. And most times I feel like other people are relieved to hear that a leader has struggle just like everybody else. And it makes them feel soothed and validated. So some things, I'm kind of big on note cards with clients. I like the idea of having like a coping note card, because what happens when we get highly anxious is we're activated in our bodies, and we're not in our best problem solving space in our brain. We're in a different part of our brain. So, the good time to problem solve is ahead of time, and to have a plan for when I get anxious and highly stressed, what is my plan? So if you can have, for instance, a couple of friends, just write down a few people in your life. You could jot this down now, or maybe later grab a note card and do this. But who are the people that you can call or text and connect with briefly, that are going to do more listening than problem solving, who are going to just hear you out and support you? We all need people like that. And some coping strategies. What works for you? Is it, for me, I like to go for a walk or run, maybe snuggle with my dog, write down things in my journal. I like to write. I have these prayer beads that a friend makes that I like to use when I pray. And it's not, she has a whole method for it, but usually I just like to hold them. And it's like something that is tangible, that I can stay focused by holding the beads. And so there are all kinds of things you can do, but just name for yourself a few coping strategies. Okay, setting a positive, informed example in the pandemic. So like knowing a few things about what's going on in the news. You don't have to know everything, but just be informed and kind of set a good example in terms of like distancing, wearing a mask, things like that. Staying in the moment is important. When we get anxious, we tend to either ruminate about the past or worry about the future rather than being present in the moment. So there are some strategies for just taking deep breaths, focusing on what is in your control, versus out of your control. Just taking some deep breaths is a good way to bring yourself back into your body and into the moment and not up in your head so much. Staying informed, but sort of limiting news intake. Sometimes we can get to feeling helpless if we are watching a lot of news intake. But it's of course important to stay informed. So maybe do that in manageable doses and, you know, monitor that. That's probably going to vary from person to person, what is helpful. And then there's a point to maybe, you know, distract yourself or be sure that you're doing other things too. I already mentioned breathing. There are grounding strategies that I teach a lot that have to do with noticing your 5 senses. So there's a strategy called 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, where if you're getting highly anxious in the moment and you need to kind of reconnect with the present moment, you can look around you and just name 5 things that you see, or 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing that you can taste. So, and the taste doesn't have to be, I mean, it could be like a snack or a glass of water, anything. But the point is getting all 5 senses involved in your current environment rather than kind of spinning into another place in your mind. So, also, you can use the crisis coping note card in a similar way by going through sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell, and thinking through some options in each of those senses that work for you. So with sight, you know, I might look at framed pictures of fun times with people I love, or certain sounds, you know, music for me is really powerful. So certain types of music tend to calm me or help me focus on preparing a talk, or, you know, there's different kinds of music I like. So whatever it is for you, kind of going through the 5 senses like that can help. When you are working with other people who are stressed, it can help to remember you don't have to solve all of their dilemmas, and instead just affirm them for their strengths, validate that what they're going through is hard, and then try to equip them. Like, ask them, what is the best thing you can do for yourself this week? Or help connect them to other resources. So there's a lot of ways you can do that. Emphasize and normalize that we are all going through additional layers of stress right now, and just acknowledging that together goes a long way. And as I mentioned, referring people for more support. So, so that kind of wraps up what I have for tonight. With, you know, next week will be week 2, and as I said, we'll get into those 8 strategies that kind of come from the second part of Gather Us In, and get into some more specifics of what can help create these kind of meaningful, transformational experiences for people in groups. So that's all I have for tonight. Okay, well, thank you all so much for your attentiveness and questions, and I will hope to see you next week. Thank you so much.